Hey everybody, welcome back. We are about to start Unit 5. Unit 5 is all about cells and specifically the cell cycle. We talked about cells a little bit in some of the previous units. As you'll remember, a cell is the basic unit of life. All living things are made up of at least one and sometimes multiple cells. In organisms like humans, where there are trillions of cells, it's very important that those cells have a way to reproduce and heal. When your cells become damaged, they need to be replaced. And so, what we're going to start looking at is something called the cell cycle. The cell cycle is a description of a series of events that allows the cell to reproduce itself and make sure that all of the information necessary for that cell to do its job is preserved and passed on to the new cell. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Now, the cell cycle has been understood more and more as our technology has improved. With early microscopes, we were not really able to see any aspect of the cell cycle except for when the cell was dividing. And so for that purpose, originally the cell cycle really only had two parts. It had a part where the cell was resting or just doing its job, and then a phase where the cell was actively dividing and splitting up the DNA that was necessary for the two new cells to be formed. And so we have this diagram right here that kind of demonstrates what that looks like. For the longest time, people just said there was an interphase step, which was kind of that resting phase, and then there was a mitosis step, which was that division phase. Mitosis concludes with something called cytokinesis. Cytokinesis is a word that describes cutting, cell cutting, because we literally take the cell and we kind of cut it in half to separate out the two pieces in one final step. So as we've learned, though, as our technology has improved and we've gained a better understanding of what DNA is and how it works, we've been able to separate interphase into three steps itself. So this resting phase called interphase has three steps. The division phase called mitosis has 5 steps, including cytokinesis, and collectively, all of these steps are what makes up the cell cycle. Now, take a look here at some of the descriptions. Interphase has two main gaps, two main portions where the cell is not necessarily doing anything related to division. It's just kind of working as a cell, doing its job. Gap 1, the cell's just growing, doing its job, carrying out normal functions. At some point, though, the cell is going to receive a signal that says it's time to divide. And when that happens, we need to move to a synthesis step where DNA is replicated. Now, we'll talk about how that actually happens in our unit about DNA, but this is a really important and pretty fascinating step. Once all of our DNA has been copied, the cell goes into final preparations that need to be made before replication can occur. And then we begin the division process. The division process, like we said, has 5 steps. It's divided into the prophase, the metaphase, the anaphase, the telophase, and then ultimately, like we said, cytokinesis. Now, as we go, there's going to be a set of checkpoints that the cell has to pass in order to proceed with this process. The checkpoints are basically there to make sure that we don't have any damaged or incorrect information being permanently copied into a new cell. So the first checkpoint, I'm going to go back up to this picture. The first checkpoint is called the G1 checkpoint. Basically, is this cell operating the way that it's supposed to? If it's not, the cell's terminated, and that way it can't replicate and create more bad cells. The second checkpoint takes place right before division occurs. And this checkpoint is more or less to ensure that the synthesis step happens properly. When DNA is synthesized, it has to be properly copied because the new cell is going to receive the same information as the original cell. And if something is wrong, then the new cell isn't going to know how to do its job. And then the final checkpoint is just to make sure that the division process has happened correctly, that the DNA has been evenly divided, and that the two new cells are ready to be unleashed on their own. Okay. All right. Now, the rate of cell division, in other words, how fast this process happens, it varies from cell to cell. Some types of cells divide relatively rapidly. Other types of cells, may not divide at all for the organism's entire lifetime. It really depends on the usage of those cells. Some cells that are in high usage areas, like the inside lining of your digestive tract or the skin on the palms of your hands and feet, those areas have to replicate rapidly because the cells are constantly being worn down. They're constantly being broken down. Other areas don't need to be replicated as much because the cells don't face as much wear and tear on a regular basis. And so, the whole process can happen in about 12 hours, but in other types of cells, it may be shorter or longer than that. Here's a diagram that kind of shows you the rate at which they not only divide, but at which those cells live. You can see that the skin cells have a much shorter lifespan than, for example, muscle tissue. Muscle tissue doesn't face the same wear and tear, and so the cells that exist are just going to be able to continue to kind of function until they need to be replaced. Okay. All right. The last thing that I want to talk about is cells that really don't replicate hardly at all. Most of your nerve cells are like this. Okay. Your nerve cells don't replicate as fast or even at all compared to some of the other cells. Another one is a lymphocyte. Lymphocytes don't really replicate unless there is a need to replicate. Like if your body gets sick and recognizes a threat. At that point, those lymphocytes, those blood cells that fight off your infections, those white blood cells, those cells are going to divide rapidly. But unless there is a reason for that to occur, then they won't. And they'll just kind of stay in a dormant state waiting to be activated. All right, so that kind of takes us through exploration 1. Make sure you go back through this lesson and complete all of these little boxes that go with it. They're a great way for you to take notes. They're a great way for you to kind of organize your thoughts and make sure you focused in on the key components for this exploration.